would like to welcome you to today's expert mini briefing webinar, Agile Offshore Software Development Teams, Why and How. My name is David Goodstein, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event, Mike Sadowski. Before we commence today's session, I would like to say a few brief words about the Outsourcing Institute, for those who are not familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. We specialize in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those in this market, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. Without further ado, I will now turn it over to our host, Mike Sadowski, to say a few brief words about himself and then begin the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Sadowski, and welcome to the webinar. Just a few words about myself. Today, I've got a couple of things I do. One, I'm an independent consultant on software development, and I tend to focus on cloud development, software development process and strategy, and as a vertical market, I've got a lot of experience in the logistics industry, so I tend to focus on a lot of logistics and supply chain technology projects. I'm also CEO of Cayuga Software Development, which is an offshore software development company with a software development shop in Ukraine. Previously, I was CIO at Odyssey Logistics Technology, which is a venture-backed logistics services and technology company, and also VP of Product Management for a logistics software vendor. And for several years, I was a management consultant with PRTM Management Consultants, which has now been swallowed up by PwC. And as far as education, I've got a degree in electrical engineering and a master's in operations research, and also an MBA. So today we're going to talk about a few things. The main topic is why we feel that Agile, dedicated software development teams is the modern approach to offshoring software development. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of software development outsourcing, how we got to where we are, the pitfalls and issues with that historical approach, and why some people have difficulty making offshore software development work, and some of the best practices around actually making Agile offshore development work in practice. So let's talk a little bit about the history of outsourcing software development and moving it offshore. We could debate when this really started, but my thought is that really in the 80s and 90s, we started seeing outsourcing of software development, typically on very large-scale projects. And the prime movers here were large companies, large government agencies, hiring consulting firms like Andersen, who you may remember was the predecessor of Accenture, and the other big six consulting firms, and a couple of other major players, Capgemini in Europe. And these firms typically used onshore resources. So here in the US, what those firms would do is they would hire a lot of recent grads from universities, and these folks were engineering grads and sometimes not even technical grads, and they put them through a boot camp, and they would teach them their approach. So oftentimes it was a waterfall approach, and typically the orientation was project-oriented. So by project-oriented, I mean that the client would bid out a big project, the consulting firm would provide a bid on the project, how much it would take and how long it would take. They would use their waterfall-based approach to nail down the requirements up front and deliver it over time. And that was the approach that was taken. The mid and late 90s, we started to see some of the offshore firms enter the market. So a big driver of that was the Y2K crisis. So you might remember leading up to the year 2000, there was a big panic about how all the legacy systems out there were going to die on New Year's of 2000. And there was a lot of fairly grunt-oriented work that needed to be done to fix those systems. So the offshore firms could enter the market and compete for that work. And the other thing was that a lot of resources were needed to do that work. It wasn't glamorous work, but you needed a lot of people to go and comb through these old systems and work on them. So there was a demand for these resources, and offshore became a supply of those resources. So that was when we started to see the firms in India really move to the forefront for the first time. We also had the internet boom, so that drove a need for more skilled resources. And the onshore firms started to need to seek resources offshore in order to compete on price. So for the first time, we had offshoring really come to the forefront when it came to software development. In the 2000s, we started to see the offshore firms really move up the food chain and begin to compete with higher-end projects with the onshore consulting firms. So they were able to do that by putting consultants on the ground here in the U.S. and other Western countries. And the other thing we started to see was some of the other countries beyond India, so Eastern Europe, to some degree South America, to a lesser degree China. So we saw all these other countries begin to do offshore software development as well. But still, by and large, it was project-by-project work, so we would bid out a project. If we were a customer on the U.S. side, we would get a bid or several bids from several of these offshore service providers. We'd pick the one we liked, maybe do a little negotiation, and the assumption was the project would get done. The team would probably scatter to the winds, more or less, once it was done. And that was how we did outsource software development and offshore software development until fairly recently. Okay. So what were the issues with that? Well, there are a lot of issues. Simply said, the results are often bad. And if you talk to people about offshore software development, there are still many people out there who will tell you it doesn't work. And we tried it back in the day, and it was a disaster. We had to throw away all the code. And there were a lot of bad results. By the same token, there are a lot of good results and a lot of people who really built their companies on this approach. So I don't think we can say it doesn't work, but there's still a lot of people walking around saying it doesn't work, and there were a lot of bad results. Why do we get these bad results? Typically, you could boil it down to two issues. Number one is requirements definition. So if you go and talk to people, as I often do, about what blew up about your offshore software development project, why didn't it work? You talk to the service provider, you talk to the onshore side client. Typically, requirements definition is the number one thing. So each side tends to point at the other and say the requirements weren't defined up front, and this led to a lot of misset expectations. We didn't get what we expected out of the offshore service provider. The offshore service provider said that the onshore service provider didn't know what they want, so we did our best. And in the end, it's requirements, so inability to define these requirements up front, which is really a requirement for the functioning of a project-by-project approach. The other thing is team communication. So if you have onshore people, you have offshore people, they speak different languages natively, typically, and you're going to have a lot of communications issues. So those will manifest themselves in terms of misunderstanding in the requirements, back to point one, but just day-to-day, a lot of difficulty in making the other side understand what their issue is, what's preventing them from moving on and making progress. The waterfall-based development process itself, though, was an issue here. So if you remember requirements definition in the waterfall-based approach, the project-based approach, a core assumption is that you can define, maybe not with certainty, but with pretty good knowledge what the requirements are up front in the project. This is a requirement for bidding accurately, in the case of the service provider, what they're going to need to charge to do the project. This is just an assumption of the waterfall-based project, that process. Within certain bounds, the assumption is that we can define the requirements up front. The only problem is that it's well known in the industry that that's not possible. And it became even less possible when we started moving towards internet time in the 2000s. So everybody was concerned about defining their projects and getting them delivered very quickly. They saw their competitors deliver products quickly, and they wanted to do it too. They didn't know all the requirements up front. So these waterfall-based processes really started breaking down. In the 80s and 90s, when you had government projects, when you had large companies contracting with the big six for projects, it was okay, and everybody knew that the requirements couldn't be nailed with certainty, but it functioned, these waterfall-based processes. They did deliver working software, but in an internet world where the requirements were a moving target, where your competitors were also trying to move very quickly, and quite simply the technology was moving fast enough that you couldn't nail everything down up front, these waterfall-based processes really stopped working for all intents and purposes. Okay, next slide, please. So, it's, again, problems with the traditional offshore software development process and approach. You tend to see a lot of difficulty in terms of the onshore team accepting the offshore team. And we can see that kind of difficulty manifest itself as passive, aggressive resistance, or aggressive resistance, but we do see a lot of lack of acceptance of the onshore team accepting the offshore team. So these are, again, typical problems that we see. Lastly, here on this slide, we see typically in the case of clients who are contracting for offshore developers, they're treating them oftentimes as a commodity purchased by the hour. So if you're a CTO or CIO, as I've been in the past, you probably get a lot of emails from offshore development companies. They're saying, "Hi, we have developers. It's $25 an hour," and it's pretty typical, and it's pretty commoditized, at least in terms of the market for these developers. The problem is with the advent of cloud-based systems, where we're developing systems on a periodic basis. We're putting out new releases perhaps quarterly, perhaps monthly, perhaps even more often. There's a realization that we need a constant stream of new features. We need constant innovation to keep customers and acquire new customers. So this kind of approach, we're treating these developers as a commodity to be brought on board for a discrete project and then released, doesn't really work very well anymore in a lot of cases. So these cloud-based systems really need a development team that understands our business, understands our technology, and understands our development process and is effective. So this commoditized approach is not working anymore, and it's one of the typical issues we see with traditional offshore software development. Okay. So what's the answer? So a much more modern approach to offshore software development, as opposed to this project-oriented waterfall approach, is an agile approach, agile software development process, combined with dedicated offshore software development teams. So let's talk about those in turn. I'm not going to redefine what agile is in this presentation. Probably a lot of you know, or you can research it on your own. But a key aspect that counters the issues that we saw in the case of these project-oriented waterfall processes that were typical in offshore software development is that you don't need to know all the requirements up front. Now, does that mean we don't need to know the requirements? No, we need to know the requirements, but the assumption is that we can more iteratively move through our development process, dribble out some useful functionality month to month or release to release, and we'll refine it over time. It just accepts that that's the process we're going to use, and it accepts that we don't know all the requirements up front. So we're not going to try to nail them all up front. We're just going to move through these requirements in a more iterative fashion, release to release. The agile process, it also fits the cloud better. So with a lot of people developing cloud-based software now, as I mentioned, you've got frequent incremental system upgrades, and the assumption is that in the cloud, we're always putting out a release very soon after we put out a prior release. So we don't need to nail all the requirements up front. We can put them out release to release. Each release we can plan which requirements we're going to put out, and if something comes up midstream, it's not a disaster. So in the project-based approach, everybody would get upset if there were new requirements, and fingers would point, and everybody would say, well, you know, we didn't nail all the requirements up front, so it's going to cost more, it's going to take longer. The deal with the cloud-based approach when we're using an agile development process is that's okay. We're not going to try and nail the requirements, and we're going to put them out incrementally. The other thing about agile process is that it does provide tools and team roles that facilitate communications. Now, defining some team roles, that's not going to solve all your communication issues, but if you recall, communications between the offshore and the onshore folks is a big issue in offshore development. And at a minimum, the agile approach does define some tools and some team roles that allow us to work through those issues, if nothing else. So with dedicated offshore development teams, the concept here is that when you're dealing with the offshore service provider, you're committing for an extended time. So you're not committing for a project that's going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and then scatter these folks to the wind. You're making a more strategic buying decision about your offshore service provider. You're saying, I'm going to make an agreement with a company and some people I can deal with for an extended time. What's that time? It could be a couple of years. It could be longer. And I'm going to contract for a team for that time. And that doesn't mean you can't flex it up and down slightly, but it does mean that you're going to make a commitment and book out this development team for a period of time. You're going to know the people's names. You're going to ideally know what they make, and have a lot of granular knowledge about who that team is and what their skills are. The benefit of that is that you're going to allow your team to learn about your business, your technology, your development process, and benefit from that learning that the team makes. And by keeping the team in place, the team will get better and better. So if all this works very well, you're going to book out this team for 2 or more years, let's say, and you'll probably keep them in place over time beyond that because things are working, the team understands your technology, and with each sprint in agile terms and each release of your cloud-based system, those people are going to become more and more useful to your business, and you'll want to keep them in place. So with that in mind, an agile process with a dedicated offshore development team seems to be a much more modern approach and should be more effective. So let's talk about how to make sure it's more effective. The biggest issue with using an agile process in an offshore environment is that if you read the Agile Manifesto and you talk to agile people out there in the industry, some of them will even tell you can't do agile in an offshore environment. I don't accept that. I know if you read some of the agile literature out there, they'll tell you that the approach is to have a very small co-located team where people get to know each other very well. They make decisions in person. They have their Scrum meetings in person, and that's great if you can do it. And I think if you're a startup, that's exactly the approach you could take. But in the real world, where most of us live, and I've lived most of my career, it's very seldom that you have a team in one location. You've probably made some acquisitions. You probably have had to look at some other locations to get the skills you need and the quantities of resources. You probably already have some offshore resources, and maybe you're thinking about adding some more. So the ideal world where you have a small co-located team just isn't real for most companies. So we've got to figure out how to make this agile process work in an offshore-onshore environment. So how do we do that? The first tip I have here is to have a big travel budget. This may sound obvious, but a lot of people try to manage offshore development by remote control. And by remote control, I mean they don't travel there at all in some cases, or very much. They are still kind of in their minds taking a project-oriented approach where they've got the feeling that we define the requirements, we send it offshore, the correct stuff should come back. As we know, in the case of a project-oriented offshoring, that didn't work. So we need to be careful not to revert to that mode when we've gone to dedicated teams in an agile environment. We need to get out there, we need to talk to them, we need to bring the offshore people onshore. So if you think about a project that has a budget of a few $100,000 per year, or even in the millions per year, you can afford to spend $50,000 or even $100,000 per year on travel and not have a big impact on the overall budget. You've only increased it a few percentage points. So what I'm advocating is set that aside and do it. In terms of Scrum meetings, the key daily meeting that we have in the Agile environment, a lot of people just live on Skype these days. It's free, it's great. Video conferencing, there are some very inexpensive video conference tools out there that you need to pay for, but some of these products are getting down to just a few $1,000s. So if you're able to, you should consider putting that in your budget for next year. In terms of development tools, there are many cheap or free tools these days. Bugzilla, Jira are good and effective. They allow you to communicate across borders. So when you look at Jira, it provides, among other things, means of communicating, having a discussion thread about an issue. That's a really effective tool for managing these kinds of issues between an onshore and an offshore team, and allows you to document the result of the discussion. So as opposed to emailing back and forth where the offshore people say, I don't understand this requirement, the onshore people try and define it, and then realize, oh, well, maybe we didn't understand it that well, and you go 10 down in your reply all email chain. These kinds of discussions and issue resolutions are better done in an offshore-onshore environment with a tool. Some of the agile communication tools and charts are effective, so it's worth looking at those. I'm not going to define them all here because we don't have time today, but if you research online, you'll find some of the tools like burn down charts are very nice, and these tools just allow you to communicate the status to all team members onshore and offshore. So it's very important to find charts and tools for doing that. Lastly, on this slide, I've got training, and it's similar to the travel budget. You know, it's easy to be cheap about this and say, well, I don't want to spend a few $1,000s on training. Can't they just read online or read a book about Agile? They can, and you can do that. But I'd argue if you have a new team, if you're standing up a new offshore team, or hiring a lot of new members, or have some people who haven't worked together before, the training, it's as much about getting the team together in person, ideally, and getting them on the same page, getting them to know each other, as much as it is educating them on the Agile methodology, which probably most people are at least somewhat familiar with these days. So again, just like the travel, don't be cheap about training. If you can afford to spend a few $1,000s on training at the start of a major launch of a new team or offshore site, it's well worth it. Okay, the next slide, please. Let's talk about the team roles. This is another one that I find when people are working in a mixed onshore-offshore environment, they're wondering how can these team roles work? And given the fact that we don't have all the people in one location, what do we do? Some of the typical Agile teams have the following members. So product owner is analogous to a product manager, and oftentimes the product manager fills this role. So they're making decisions on the functionality that'll be in a given release, or what the functionality means, what it should be in a business sense. And typically that person should be onshore because they should be closer to the business people and the users. In some cases, you'll find offshore software development shops that will provide a product manager, and it's worth considering this. I think in rare cases, you'll find someone offshore who gets the business, who can get inside the heads of the user, and it's worth taking advantage of that. But in most cases, I think I'm going to say this should be onshore. Program manager, this role, it's probably better to do it onshore if you're going to have a program manager. I think it's optional, in my view, whether you need a program management office. I'm not the biggest fan of them, but some people are. Probably put that onshore. You may want to consider putting it offshore, though, because that's probably where, over time, the bulk of your resources will be, and you may want to put those those program managers a little bit closer to the development resources to know what's going on and be able to resolve those issues. So it's something to consider, but typically most people put that onshore. The architect, if you're going to have an architect, typically that person would be onshore. I've seen issues where the architect is onshore but ignored, and you may want to consider putting that person offshore if the bulk of your developers are there. The reason is that if the developers are all offshore and the architect is onshore, you can get a phenomenon where the developers are ignoring these beautiful architecture documents that the onshore architect is producing, and he's not very effective if he's not close to the developers. So it's something to consider. Typically you're going to see these people onshore, but I've seen some effective architects working offshore. Development team leads, so these are folks leading a small team of developers. Typically they should be co-located with their developers. So if the developers are offshore, team lead is offshore. If the developers are onshore, team lead is onshore. The quality assurance lead, oftentimes we'll see this person offshore with some resources, onshore with some resources offshore. I've seen effective QA leads offshore though, so I think that's something where you can consider pushing the whole thing offshore. It's up to you. In terms of certain QA skills like QA automation, you might even find you have a better mix of skills available offshore. IT operations, I like making them part of the development team because, again, more and more in a cloud environment, these people are affected by what happens with the release, and any changes they should be aware of should be something that's communicated through the team structure. You can put these people onshore typically. I think, again, in a cloud environment, if you're using some of the cloud services out there like Amazon or Rackspace these days, you don't really have a world where you're going down to the data center and putting more memory in a server. You're getting all of that from your service provider, Amazon or Rackspace, so you can procure that from anywhere. So you can begin to move more and more of the stuff offshore, and that's something you'll see more and more, so a mix of onshore and offshore IT operations folks. So in summary, you've got to think about all these team roles. You've got to think about where they can be located, and with our communications mechanisms we discussed on the prior slide, find a way to get those team members working well together. So with our best practices for Agile development in an offshore environment, the requirements are a key issue. And we talked about requirements being a key stumbling block to traditional offshore development. How do you make sure those offshore developers understand the requirements, and how do you make sure that any requirements issues are resolved in a timely fashion, so we don't have this issue where the wrong stuff is delivered, or you have a lot of finger pointing where nobody was able to figure out what was required. In the offshore environment and in an Agile environment, we want to use a requirements management tool to manage the so-called backlog of requirements. So backlog simply means a list of requirements that are under consideration for future implementation in a release. So if we've loaded all these into some kind of tool, we can decide which ones are going to go in the next release and which ones we're going to put in future releases, and make that decision at the start of the sprint. The good thing about these online tools that are available today is that they're pretty reasonably priced. So you can use tools like Bugzilla. You think of Bugzilla as a bug fix tool, but a bug tracking tool. But you can also use it for requirements management. You can use some of the fancier tools like HP or IBM Rational for requirements management if you have a big budget or already have it in-house. But the point is that inexpensive tools are available. They work over the web, and they allow you to communicate between the onshore-offshore team. What's in the current release that we're working towards? What's the definition of those requirements? And allows the development folks to indicate which requirements have some issue, need some further definition. So those tools are very important, and they're inexpensive, so you need to pick one and use it. In terms of defining what's in the next release, we're going to do that at the start of the sprint, and we're not going to make changes. So this is one of the the key things about the Agile approach, that we're going to dribble out the features over time. It's not a big deal if we didn't nail the current features release, current release's features. This release, we can push it off till next time because the next release is coming right around the corner after all. So if you have a larger project, you'll want to divide it into a lot of smaller requirements and load them into your requirements management tool. The important thing is when you're ramping up an offshore team to give them something simple to do and let them get in the game and do something very quickly. So by defining our requirements in a very granular way and in a very simple way, we can make sure that the offshore team, as they're getting in the game, has something to do and can make a contribution. So this is a big confidence builder for the offshore people. It also gives the onshore people some confidence that the onshore or the offshore team can actually do something useful. So very granular requirements, use a tool, and be willing to give the offshore team, as you're ramping up, some simple wins and get them in the game. So requirements management, it's key to find a process and a set of tools to implement that in the mixed onshore-offshore environment. And a lot of it is really getting a culture of resolving these issues through the Agile process, but also using the correct tools that are available these days, and take some time up front to define the process that you're going to use with that tool. So that concludes the content of the presentation, except for a few words about my firm. So as I said, I do some independent consulting on software development issues for some clients. But the other thing I've been working on is my firm, Cayuga Software Development. We're a US-based offshore software development company with resources in Ukraine. So I've found over the years I've been involved in software development in Ukraine that you can get very cost-effective and technically excellent resources in Ukraine. So that's where we've chosen to have our resources. Our focus, as you can guess from my presentation, is creating offshore software development teams that work as extensions of our clients' onshore teams. So we're not too focused on project-by-project oriented work. We're focused on setting up development teams, getting an agile process going with our clients' onshore resources, and making a long-term commitment to getting that working well so that our clients get some benefit as those teams ramp up, learn our clients' business and their development processes. So over time, we find those offshore development teams become great extensions of our clients' onshore teams and make very strong contributions. And that's our approach. So we focused on just what was in this presentation: agile software development process and dedicated offshore development teams. So I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar about agile offshore software development teams. If you'd like to contact me, you can see my email address there. You might also want to check out my blog, where I provide more detail on some of these concepts. And thanks for joining us again, and thanks to the Outsourcing Institute for hosting today's webinar.